Hey, Joe, how are you doing? Nice to see you. High Commissioner, I guess. So we're introduce you to my colleague Andy.
I rushed with this presentation of 9 slides. In this,
you're very dedicated.
Most
people just okay, so we have one slide. You should load that onto the computer.
That will help me just to give my opinion. So let me give you this, but it's not well polished. I think I will have time to.
We weren't expecting any slides, so perfect.
I didn't know. I could even prepare in advance. I take the decision today.
Yeah. Okay. Wow,
I prepare something just to read, but now an idea came into my mind to prepare a presentation.
Yeah. Oh, why not? Delicious. Yeah, that's nice.
It is 9 slides,
yeah.
So
shall we put this on here?
Yeah, no problem.
Is it saved on your pen drive?
Yes, please. But if need be, I can even polish it after or review it if necessary.
It doesn't have to be perfect. Yes. I'm sure people will be listening to you more than reading the slides.
Yes, I know.
Yeah. But they just help impress people.
Can I have some copies? Can you print for me?
Copies of your slides?
Yes.
I can, but
if possible, if not.
It might take longer.
I know.
Than
I
we
know.
have. Let me see. I'll go and ask someone to print them. So this is you?
Yes, mine. That one.
This one at the top?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll just wrap it in. Check that it works. Yeah, that seems to work. Okay. So I'll see if someone can print them for you.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll go and take it to print?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. There's 2.
Yeah, number 2. Yeah.
What do they like?
That's 2. Yeah.
To the IGC.
That's okay. No, you can just click again.
IGC conference. It is 2. Sorry. It is 2.
Yeah.
2. There are 2 copies. There is 2.
Yeah. I know. 15 minutes.
And the rest of the feedback form.
I'm trying to figure out how to set up the room. So we'll just leave it this basically. They have to figure what's is someone going to be
I think we're okay with the technology. I can put it up there.
So one of our colleagues is just printing a hard copy for you,
No
so she'll
problem.
bring it in when it's done. So everything's there.
We don't by any chance have a background slide for this, do we? So when the minister talks or whatever.
I don't think so. We could make one.
Hello.
Shall we? Shall I go and grab some? That would be helpful. Yeah, okay, I'll grab some. We haven't met. I'm not Isa.
Richard from Rwanda.
Are you discussing?
Yeah, we're discussing.
So I'm presenting that.
Ah, thank you.
Yes.
I didn't meet you. Yes. Ah, okay, but I know you on the paper. On the paper.
Ah, sorry.
Yes.
Yes, so it's, yes.
Yes.
We're the ones.
have been
And yes.
Yes, yes, it's good to meet
Thank
you.
you. Good to meet you too.
We benefited from having a few of your comments in
I
advance.
heard there was very useful comments in
I did it today.
although we didn't yet take them. We were gonna steal your thunder and address them before, but we didn't. But yeah, some very helpful comments.
Thank you.
Are you here for a while, or do you go back?
I'll go back on Saturday.
Okay, so we have more time to talk. What time do you leave tomorrow?
After a month, which I think we're putting together.
Oh, for the team. Okay. Okay. So Henrik had to run off, but he's not sure if he'll be in tomorrow.
He's not going to go there.
No, he can't. His wife is away, so he's got a child. But
Tomorrow morning.
so he's going to email me if he's coming.
That'd be great.
So we can sit down with him. He said that the woman had worked with him in Rwanda. And he said we should talk also about the data when they were looking at it.
Hello?
Chief Officer Organization.
Yes. Thank you very much. That's enough. Hmm.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin to sit down.
Okay. And these are them. Yeah, perfect.
People are going to be, if history is any lesson, there will be people that will be drifting in shortly. So coffee is starting to pipe from downstairs. It's really a pleasure to welcome you to the program on Rwanda we have this afternoon. We have some terrific studies that are going to be presented, virtually all of which have been requested by the Rwandan government. As many of you know, issues of public sector performance, tax collection, of expanding exports are of great concern to Rwanda. In fact, they are principal drivers of growth in different respects. So, we have with us a very rich agenda. Let me just run through it with you a little bit. We're going to be we're going to benefit from the opening remarks of the Minister of Trade and Industry in Rwanda, Minister Kanimba, a supporter of the IBC in Rwanda for several years. I had the good pleasure of knowing him when he was the governor of the central bank. And we enjoyed a long and collaborative relationship, so I'm delighted to welcome him here today. We're also going to be talking about increasing tax revenues, a study that was done, in fact, by Nada Essa and Andy Zeitlin, looking at the effects of electronic billing machines. We're delighted also to have Richard Dada here with us from the Revenue Authority to act as a discussant. And I hope you kind of give them a hard time. I mean, you know, we should make sure they earn their salary. We're also going to have a presentation on homeless contracts, what's called the Dividigo system in Rwanda. Unique, actually, in its use in Rwanda among African countries. One of the impressive systems put in place to improve public sector performance. That study will be done by Andy Zeitlin and Claire Lieber, who will present those studies. We're also delighted to welcome Doreen Kaganama from the presidency, who has also been a principal interlocutor with the country team over the years. And finally, we'll have a presentation on coffee washing, which just walked in. Has been doing this together with where's the lead? Who's here? There's the lead. Okay. So I would suggest we begin, and let me welcome Minister Kanimba to begin the session with some opening remarks. Just a few words about, if you want to stand up and come here and speak to the assembled multitudes, that would be great. He is, as I mentioned, Rwanda's Minister of Industry and Trade, has worked tirelessly to increase and diversify Rwanda's exports. I'm just reading what's written here. In fact, it's actually quite true. Sally wrote this. He has degrees in engineering, statistics, and economics, and chaired the Rwandese Governance Task Force, which negotiated Rwanda's first structural adjustment program, supported by the World Bank and IMF, and probably one of the few structural adjustment programs that actually succeeded in Africa. In any case, I'm going to turn the program over to you, Minister. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to the National Growth Center for inviting me to attend this Growth Week. As Richard said, Rwanda has been engaged for quite a number of years. A lot of work has been done. Actually, I was impressed last week when I want to confirm my attendance to this Growth Week. I asked Richard to remind me about the long list of research papers IGC has been working on in Rwanda. The list is quite impressive. And this actually has raised one of the fundamental questions I have. When you look at the volume of research work done, and the first question which comes in mind, how this has been influencing policy decision making in the country. And for me, I don't think I have a clear answer. I know I've been really deeply engaged in Richard. He came to pay a courtesy call in my office, and we discussed and agree on some of the issues I think are very important to guide the work of IRIS in the country. But I may confess, I think sometimes myself I feel greedy because this work which is done, we share the funding recommendations. but I'm not sure the way this work has been fueling the decision-making process in Rwanda is still questionable. It's still questionable. Maybe that should be one of the points of discussion. I'm not waiting my opening remarks talking about the three topics we're going to discuss. But let me engage you on some of the fundamental questions I have as we continue to collaborate with the International Growth Center in this research agenda. So as you know, Rwanda has a very ambitious growth agenda translated in our Vision 2020, and within our 5-year planning process through economic development and policy reduction strategies, which are renewed every 5 years. But for the current period, we set very ambitious growth targets. Based on our performance in the last 15 years, as you know, Rwanda has been in a position to achieve very impressive growth performance. And this has created actually a very strong confidence in ourselves. And we thought maybe there is a room to do more. That's the reason why now we are targeting a double-digit growth, because we have been in a position to achieve an average growth rate of 8% on a consistent manner in the last, let's say, 12 years. But for this kind of growth to happen, we are convinced it's not going to happen overnight. There may be some structural change we need to do in our economy. Just to give you an example, we know there is a strong correlation between the credit to the private sector having an economy in relation to GDP and the pace for higher growth. But also, you can't expect to grow faster if your savings policy for longer-term domestic resources mobilization are not clear how these are going to back such kind of growth ambition. But also there is a fundamental question, as you know, Rwanda and somehow to achieve a high growth rate just in the aftermath of the 1994 genocide. We have been supported by the international community, and the country has been in a position for a long period of time to mobilize quite a significant amount of resources. And these have sustained high growth rate. And we know this is not going to continue over time going forward. The big question is how is the capacity of the country to generate its own foreign exchange through our export policies and programs to take over the aid and maintain an increasing growth rate. These are the fundamental questions, and these targets for exports, you have been targeting a growth of 28% per annum up to 2020. For the credit to the economy, we are looking to transform structurally the current status of very low 15% stock credit to GDP, actually to double to 30%. So all these are interrelated. Why we set this very ambitious agenda? I can tell you there is no strong research background which has been done to make sure that these targets are achievable. If they are achievable, what should be the path to achieve them? And I challenge International Growth Center if there is really a way to make the work in Rwanda relevant and engage the policy-making decision process. I appreciated one of the messages from the opening remarks by the IGC leaders this morning that the approach IGC has been taken is to establish effective collaboration between government and researchers. I think this message is very key. If we can make sure that we are developing a research program supported by IGC to tell or to support the government of Rwanda in understanding what does it take to Rwanda to achieve a double-digit growth, to increase exports at 28%, or simply tell us this is very ambitious, I don't think we are going to be in a position to do it in the coming 7 years. What does it take to transform the structure of the economy from a very low base of 15% today to 30% in the next 7 years? These are the key research topics in my view. There is no way if you engage with the government to conduct some research on these topics, I'm convinced whatever the findings and recommendations we are going to make will be taken very, very seriously. So, without taking much of your time, I know we have a lot of work to do to discuss the research papers which have been prepared. I will contribute my own ideas on some of them. But my high expectations from IGC engagement in Rwanda going forward will be really helping us to understand and respond to the big questions that have been raised. Thank you for that.
So let's turn to the first set of studies, decile and Nada Essa. Nada is going to present, I gather. Nada is the lead academic for the IGC in South Sudan. We've borrowed her for a few extra weeks here to do some work for us in Rwanda. She's an associate professor of public policy and economics at Georgetown University, a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a former deputy assistant secretary of the U.S. Treasury for economic policy. Her work on taxation has been published in major economic journals and is widely cited in the media. She's a recipient of the National Tax Association's outstanding doctoral dissertation in government finance. I want to say it was just last year, but
we'll skip that one.
In any case, I can keep talking about your accolades here if you want me to take more time while you're brewing out coffee.
No, I think that's fine. Thank you for having me. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to get to do this work in Rwanda. Andy Zeitlin and Sally Murray, who are both here, and to whom all questions should be directed, were co-authors, as well as a graduate student of ours at Georgetown, Sahil Kakut. So this is preliminary, these are preliminary results that I'm going to present today. And the idea here for us is to get feedback as much as to provide answers. In fact, we're going to raise as many questions probably as we provide answers. So to put this in context, one of the most major differences between richer and poorer countries is in the share of GDP that they collect in taxes. So if you look at a correlation between per capita income and tax share in GDP, you see a positive slope. Why is that important? It's not necessarily good or bad. It's important because arguably what that means is that it takes away revenues from governments where arguably the needs are greatest. So these are important in cash-strapped countries. The empirical observations that we have suggest that the difference between rich and poor countries is driven by many factors, including, maybe largely, the bases that they tax, whether it's consumption tax or income tax, whether it's trade taxes, for example. I think the most interesting suggestion, though, from these observations is that the tax rates themselves are not the explanation. So, adjusting for what tax base you're looking at, what the evidence tells us is at equivalent or roughly equivalent tax rates, rich countries do a better job of collecting revenues, which gets us back to tax compliance and tax administration as potentially important explanations. And this is probably intuitive, but in economics, oops, sorry. In economics, that's not a trivial observation. And the reason goes back to the basic framework that economists use in tax. So the basic optimal tax framework says the government has some revenue requirement, and the only thing we need to worry about is how it collects it, what taxes, how it should structure the tax system, or the tax rates. Evasion, compliance, administration were basically irrelevant because the assumption was that taxes can be elected at zero cost. So it kind of brushed all of these considerations aside. Tax compliance and evasion were addressed, but in a completely separate track. And recent work has actually been very informative because they brought together these two avenues to talk about tax systems. This is an approach that is being formally developed by Joel Slemrod and some of his students at the University of Michigan. I mean, the important thing that they say is that we need to think about the technology of tax collection at the core of the tax system. So it's no longer just preferences or the government's welfare function that matters. Rather, it's how taxes are collected. And ultimately, what it says is that how easy taxes are to collect is critically important for how you structure the tax system. You can't put that aside and just think about the optimal structure or the optimal schedule. So in this project, we address an important policy question, which is how the government, there's two cans, so how can the government encourage compliance? And we believe that this research ultimately contributes to this new literature on tax systems. The analysis that we're going to present is of electronic billing machines that were introduced in Rwanda. So we believe they represent an important initiative because it has the potential to strongly improve tax compliance at relatively low cost. And we'll come back to this issue of who bears the cost of these machines. There is an investment that's required. And so the two questions that we look at are what has been the impact of EVMs on tax revenues, and where and how might the results that we find be strengthened in the future. So these are basic policy questions. We address these in two different parts. So we use administrative tax data of the universe of VAT payments, and I'll talk more specifically about the data in a moment, to look at the overall impact of the EVM and the introduction of the EVM on the VAT revenues, and then to try to get a sense of what the channels are through which it's operating. We do a mystery shopper study where we send people into shops to see whether the EVM machines are actually being used. And we have some very interesting results, suggestive results from those studies, from that exercise. Okay? So just to summarize the findings before I go through some of the detail. The period that we look at, which is the first quarter of 2012 through the first quarter of 2014, we find strong growth in EVM adoption. And so that's the first step. They're legally required. We then look at how much they're actually being adopted in the market. We find substantial variation by sector, but I'll show you that there's significant growth over this period. We find an effect on revenues of approximately 8% over this period. And so some of the important things where we have some questions is that we find important variation in the responses by sector and firm size, where the metric for firm size is what the VAT revenues were prior to the introduction of the EVM. And these are suggestive for how the revenue authorities in Rwanda might think about increasing further adoption. The mystery shopper study suggests something really important, and that's something that we've learned in some of the recent empirical evidence on compliance, which is that the role of the consumer in increasing compliance is not trivial. We've seen this in a couple of experiments in Brazil, the primary one in Brazil, where consumers were induced to request a receipt when they make a purchase, and then that receipt entered them into a lottery. And every month, someone would win some pot of money. So the incentive to request the receipt is important. That is one of the channels through which you generate record keeping or information on how much these economic activities taking place among these enterprises. So we think that there's scope in Rwanda to use that as well. And the beauty of using the consumer in these cases is that it's zero cost for the government. Okay, so I'll talk very quickly about some about the data, show you the evidence on take-up, and then the average effects, and then some of the heterogeneity. And then at the end, I'll come back to the mystery shopper pilot. All right, so for anyone who hasn't seen this, which quite a few of you, I suspect, this is what the EBM receipt looks like. So the electronic billing machine prints out a receipt of this sort. It also transmits the information to the revenue authorities, in principle, in real time. Now, there may be issues with connectivity, there may be issues about whether or not they work, but if they work, this is what happens. So the information that the tax authorities get include the tax ID, the item that's being purchased, and this can be used to look at whether some items are exempt from the VAT, in which case it is zero rate, the VAT amount, and then down here you have the time of the sale and the consecutive receipt number. So we know how many transactions took place in a period of time and where this falls. Now, one of the interesting things that I had not realized before looking at these results was that there are actually now machines in the marketplace that skim transactions. So these numbers can actually be fudged. Right? Technology is always catching up with, with policy, I guess. All right, so the data sources, our primary data source is an administrative data set that comes from RRA that has quarterly VAT declarations from, as I said, 2012 quarter 1 to 2014 quarter 1. In addition, we have EBM registration data that allows us to know exactly when the EBM, the electronic billing machine, was registered and in principle was active. So we combine these data, and so we're able to have in one data set the onset of the EBM as well as the reported or the VAT declarations and payments. All right, so this is just some basic statistics on what we see in the data. We look at these are the sectors that we have in our data. We had to group them. I think there were 200 codes, something around between 160 and 200 codes. So this is just one way of grouping them that's presentable. And what you can see here is that there's a lot of variation in firm size across these sectors in our data. So that's one side of it. But in terms of the size of VATs based in 2012, there's also substantial variation. The largest ones being hotels and construction. And this is going to be important later when we talk about some of the heterogeneity, because it raises a question of whether the goal ultimately is to raise more VAT revenue as opposed to getting more firms into the VAT system. Okay. So this speaks to the substantial heterogeneity in size. Again, the metric is VAT payments in 2012. Okay, so these are deciles. So the bottom decile is over here, the top decile is over here, and on the horizontal axis, what you see is the 2012 VAT in using a log scale. You can see that the average down here, the average payment down here is somewhere around 1,000 million francs, and up here it's in somewhere around 100 million. So these are very different firms, and that's obviously going to create some complications, or at least make us a little bit careful about some of the interpreting some of the results. The growth over this period has been, as you see, exponential. Starting in 2012 and in 2014, we count a taxpayer as having an activated EBM in a given quarter if the activation takes place before the end of that quarter. So some firms may start, say, in quarter 1 2013, but wouldn't show up if they haven't completed the registration process with RRA. That tends to be a small and stable subset across sector. So we're not particularly worried about missing some firms or putting some firms in different periods than when they actually activated. All right. So the impairment analysis using the administrative data is basically done using a difference in difference approach. We look at the relationship between the log of VAT for firm I in sector S in quarter Q. And we adjust for the sector and for the quarter, and we also allow different trends, levels and trends, different level of VAT as well as trends in VAT growth for different firms. What we're ultimately interested in is this coefficient here on whether or not the firm has an EBM activated in that quarter. So the question that we try to answer here is how much does a firm's VAT increase in the quarter in which it adopts an EBM after conditioning on the prior level of VAT payments, the trajectory, the growth in VAT payments, and also allowing for aggregate shocks in the economy. Yes?
Could you tell a bit more about the kind of the design of the rollout? Was it? I think you mentioned at some point that it was a legal requirement to adopt this. Is it costless for the firm?
It's not costless.
Hand them out?
It varies.
Or a sample of firms on which, like, when you say, we're catching most firms, we know that they've adopted these. What's the sample of firms? Is it the universe of firms, or?
That's a very good question. So the initial, up to the end of the third quarter of 2013, and these guys can correct me, there was a pilot done by RRA in which they gave out the machines to us, so about 700 and 800 firms. Right? So over here, these were free to those firms. Starting in principle, the idea was that by the first quarter of 2014, all firms were required to have it. Now, in practice, that was delayed until March, I believe 2014, where the actual requirement became universal. These firms over here would have had to purchase them from an RRA-approved vendor. So they would bear the cost of the machines. And that's something that we're looking at in terms of thinking about the welfare implications of these. The other question this raises is, in addition to the cost of the machine, what happens to the price that consumers pay? Are these costs, whether it's the tax as well as the cost of these machines passed on to the consumer in some way? So I'll come back to that. So we don't have an experiment in any sense. We're just using the way that RA rolled out.
But for example, these 800 first firms, how were they chosen?
That's a very good
They come from
question.
the initial register?
That's a good question. Do you want to speak to that, Sally?
I was going to invite the deputy to speak to.
Well, I didn't want you to reveal. I didn't want to put you on the spot. Reveal inside information.
The first one, consideration was made on some sectors. In the service sector, we did consider restaurants and construction, but randomly.
So there was some criteria, but also some random assignment. Okay, so these are the basic results. We ran different regressions where we adjusted for firm fixed effects, firm specific trends, and then varied that. Our preferred estimate is the one in column 3, where we have both the firm specific trends and firm fixed effects and quarter indicators, which we have throughout. This number suggests, this is the 8% that we talked about earlier. So this is the number that tells us that revenues increased by 8% amongst firms that have an active EBM over this period. Okay. And so we're going to stick with that for now. This is an average effect. And one of the things we were interested in is how that varies by sector and also by size, by previous VAT payments. So this figure has the estimated impact on VAT payments on the horizontal axis. It has different sectors on the vertical, and this line up here is the average 8% effect. So what we're looking at is where different sectors lie relative to this average. So what does this tell you? It tells you that, forget hotels for a moment, it tells you that hotels, oh, the other thing I should know, so this would be the effect for hotels. It's negative, but this band tells you the standard deviation, so that suggests it's not significantly different from zero, even if it is a negative number. Okay? So you can see that firms, the retail, wholesale, transportation, manufacturing are basically at zero. Transportation maybe is statistically significant, exactly zero, right? So most of the action in terms of impact seems to be with construction, computing, to some extent restaurants. So keep that in mind, right? So there is substantial variation across different sectors. I'll come back to what we can take away from that. The other thing we looked at was the EVM, the variation in EVM impact by decile of 2012 VAT payments, where this is the lowest decile, the firms that Martha has about $100,000 Rwandan francs in 2012, all the way up to the very top. And so what we're seeing here is that the impact is increasing with firm size as we measure it. This is one of our big question marks as to what's going on up here with the largest firms. And to some extent, this is intuitive, that the smallest firms are the ones where the EVM is having the larger impact. So you might imagine firms that are very large in size would already have an established mechanism for paying VAT taxes. And some of them had already some kind of an electronic system to pay taxes. So I'm not particularly surprised that up here we don't find anything. But where the positive action is at the bottom. Now, at the bottom, you're not going to get much revenue. These are small firms, right? So that's the trade-off that these results seem to suggest. Any questions? Yeah.
This is interesting because the paper you mentioned earlier in Brazil shares the opposite result.
The wholesale, well, that was it.
Most of the effect at the middle of the distribution, and no effect at the bottom and no effect at the top. But it's not VAT, so maybe it's total. Like our argument is that at the very bottom of the distribution, you can't really make them comply. At the very top, they're already compliant, and so you can't even make it in the middle. But you seem to be.
Yeah, we're not. I mean, but that's also remember the intervention there is the consumer asking.
But it's interesting that you could
yeah,
see very
we should. And I should say these are preliminary, so we might end up worksheets, but yeah, that's not what we're finding. Okay. Okay. So that's what this is what the administrative data tells us. There's an average effect of 8% that seems to vary by firm size. It varies by firm sector. But what we don't know is what's going on behind the scenes. So why do some sectors have these? Why do sectors have differential effects? And what does that mean for increasing use of EVMs as well as increasing revenues? So what we did is conducted a small street shopper experiment. We sent in enumerators into 129, so we did 129 visits to shops that actually have EVMs in Kigali, which is important also. And we had them purchase basic consumer products, as well as food staples, so tea, coffee, soap, that cost somewhere between 500 and 1,000 Rwandan francs. And embedded in this is we had the enumerators go in, make the purchase, and walk out, and let us know if they received the receipt or not. In half the cases, we had them request the receipt themselves, and we find some very important results across these two types of visits. Keep in mind that the enterprises, neither the enterprises nor the goods are represented. We just wanted to just get in the marketplace and see what's going on. So what we find is that without prompting the shop owner for a receipt, the fraction that were given these EBM receipts was about 21%.
And this is of all of those that have received EBMs, they have the machine physically there, they just don't use it.
Yes. Yes.
So to go back to the point of size, though from a slightly different angle, did you have variation in the amount of stuff that your mystery shoppers were buying?
The amount of stuff?
The amount of commodities.
Commodities. I don't believe we had.
No, not substantially. I mean, I think that's, so this is a low budget little pilot exercise. I think one hypothesis consistent with these data is that people don't record very small.
Yeah, exactly. Sure.
Yeah. But here's the important part, which is just asking for a receipt increases the chances by 42 percentage points in terms of the likelihood of getting it. So just that simple act where you encourage the consumer to ask can have tremendous impacts. And I think we are very high on this result. It's again small, but it's very suggestive that there's something powerful going on here, that we can actually think about incentivizing people to help increase compliance. All right, so the other question that's important is who's paying for the tax? These firms now have to pay, right? So the likelihood that their payments are increasing on average. It's not sufficient to say that they're bearing that cost because they may be able to pass it on to consumers. The incidence of a tax has nothing to do with who's required to pay the tax. So the question that we try to get at is what's happening to the prices of these goods, and therefore how much of the tax is passed on. We don't have very strong evidence, but we have some that suggest that among transactions that are about 1,300 francs, about 111 is through the price, which is the price effect. So that's how much prices are going up relative to transactions. So it's about just under 10%.
How much does it cost to purchase one of these machines?
I don't know. What is the cost of the machine?
The initial price is
It is okay. Start by 5,000 francs, but now it is at
350 Rwandan, 350,000.
yes.
That's about 300 pounds. Yeah. And so it is a substantial upfront cost for these, especially for small.
Like a race.
Sorry?
I don't know.
500.
$500. Yeah, but so for these enterprises, there is a smaller one.
Is there any other advantage to using the EBM? Does it connect you to the national payment system? For debit cards or things like that?
At the moment, it's just connected to RRA. Is your question, is it linked also to the registration data and say the business?
No, to the payment system within the banking system.
Not that I'm aware
But
of.
isn't an incentive to get it so that you have access to people who are not carrying cash? Got a debit card or a credit card.
Yes, for the most part, these are not debit-based debit transactions. Rwanda has also introduced a mobile platform for tax payments and eventually for tax declarations, and eventually it'll be for tax payments as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that 10% effect on price, how does that compare to the tax rate? Like, is there still something that...
So it depends on the goods, but the ones that the receipt that I showed you had a VAT of 18%.
Okay.
Now I wouldn't run with this.
No, but it's very interesting, right? So.
But they're working in that direction of having some of the tax being passed through.
So how do you encourage consumers to ask to pay more?
Well, you enter them into a lottery. But we should say that one of the things that we need to think more about is the market structure. Okay, so some firms, you'd expect, are limited in their ability to pass the tax through if there is substantial competition. Okay, so that's something we haven't thought through about, and we would like to in the future. Oh, okay. All right. I think I'm, yeah, so I'm just at the conclusions now. So we find positive effects on EVM take-up, a positive effect on receipts, a lot of heterogeneity, and important findings from the mystery shopper that suggests maybe consumer empowerment will be important.
Great, thank you very much. Can I invite the Deputy Commissioner General just to say a few words and give them out a tough time? Yeah. You can also ask her to do more.
That's this guy. Would you like to sit?
Thank you. I'd like also to join my minister to express my gratitude and on behalf of the management of Rwanda Revenue Authority for the invitation to come to participate in this important conference. I have had an opportunity to discuss with the researchers on this item, but let me introduce, first of all, the VAT was introduced in Rwanda in 2006, subsequent to the reform and the modernization of the tax system that started in 1998. Since its introduction, the VAT has played a significant role in achieving the tax collection target. It has the highest share of the total tax, and its contribution is almost 34%, starting from 30% in 2006. As compared to tax ratio to GDP, its share is about 5%. So it is an important tax head in our tax system. These are issues within the tax system in general and the VAT in particular. We have observed that low compliance level among some taxpayers, especially among small and medium taxpayers, in form of not issuing receipts to customers, hide sales or underreporting tax to pay, or keeping two sets of books of accounts, one for own management and the one to show to the tax authority officials for tax audit purpose. There are also some false deductions when it comes to declare or to request for VAT refund. All these compliance behavior issues not only resulted into loss of revenue, but also to the costs of tax collection. So one of the strategies to improve the compliance of VAT was the investment by the government in the electronic billing machine system, along with other investments such as the e-filing and e-tax as mentioned earlier. Now in Rwanda, taxpayer can declare or can file and pay online. That is for large taxpayers, medium, as well as for small and micro. Micro taxpayers especially are using the mobile declaration, the telephone. They can declare using their telephone and pay at the bank. The motivation factor to adopt the EVM tax system is to improve the VAT compliance by transmitting sales transaction on real time directly to RRI server, which could have another indirect impact on improving on income tax and other revenues. For example, if VAT is accurately declared, it means that you can know the sale, the turnover, and also the income tax can grow through using the EVM machine. But it has to be backed by a law. Rwanda has electronic transaction law. This has been implemented earlier before, as Rwanda is developing the ICT. So the law on electronic transaction was in place, and it has facilitated to make the review of the VAT law to start using or implementing the EBM machine. So the devices are installed with the help of an approved vendor, as mentioned earlier. By this vendor is to be certified by the Revenue Authority. So these are our observations and comment on the research. The research is made an analysis on the adoption rate and the VAT payments impact on the EBM. The adoption rate was found growing, which is a result of education campaign. But also, I can mention that the compliance behavior on issuing invoice has also improved among some business sectors. The culture of asking the invoice was not there before, but people are starting requesting the invoice. But customers has not sensed the importance of requesting the invoice. This is a factor that could contribute to the optimization of EDM if the culture of asking the invoice is already there among the citizens. So, together with my colleagues, I have had the opportunity to discuss with Professor Andrew and Sally during the presentation to the RI management. We appreciated the way the methodology was adopted, and even the sample that has been taken was representative because all business centers have been taken into consideration, and also the type of the business as well. And this research, we estimated that we contribute to identify where there is a gap for improvement and where focus need to be done. Indeed, it's a fact that the manufacturing sector and the restaurant have the highest rate of adopting the EBA machines. This is a result of enforcement and taxpayers education, because these are well-organized chambers, so it is easy to discuss with the players in these sectors, but also restaurants earlier were at the low rate of compliance. So the low adoption rate for the business services or consultants can be attributed to the provisions of the law that give exemption to use EBM for firms that can demonstrate that their VAT sales ratio is limited during the year. But this can create a loophole. We are studying, or we are proposing that to review the law to make sure that this will not contribute to the low adoption of EBM by these sectors. I mean the consultants sector. Concerning the findings, the research has come to the conclusion that the adoption of EBM was estimated to VAT payment increase at 8%. We discussed these findings, and we have estimated to be relevant because we have found that the EBM adoption was not growing at the expected rate. But we've noticed that where the level of frequency in VAT separate check in most of the business centers was directly related to the VAT invoicing production through EBM. This we have noticed during the enforcement of the EBM. But I can say it is too early to make such conclusion because that rate is growing. From that perspective, some other strategies need to be strengthened, such as the consumer awards, lottery policy to give prizes to the winners by sampling some invoices that have been issued. This has started. This would contribute to enhance the culture among citizens of requesting the invoice. We estimated also that the impact will go as some accompanying policies will be implemented to make sure that there is no price competition for compliant taxpayers compared to non-registered taxpayers on VAT. For example, in the draft law, we are proposing that some service sectors, such as hardwares, supermarkets, garages, and others, will be obliged to register for VAT despite their turnover thresholds. Because in these sectors, you cannot find micro taxpayers. Micro taxpayers and the retail, they are not in these sectors. In order to start this business, you have a considerable investment that is not below the VAT threshold. This to make all taxpayers at the same level of price competition. Of course, some of the measures is to intensify the taxpayers' education by sector of activities and by category of taxpayers, and engage in discussions with the business community to increase the voluntary compliance. The review of the law to take care of price competition for compliant taxpayers compared to the taxpayers on VAT is important. For example, as I said earlier, some sectors, taxpayers will be obliged to register for VAT to ensure that all are in the VAT tax net. This to make all taxpayers at the same level of price competition. Thank you for kind attention.
Thanks, Richard. We can take one question to Richard and the team, while maybe we ask Andy, do you want to come up and prepare the presentation? We're kind of short on time, so we're going to move ahead. But please, what's your question?
Thank you. My name is Pamela from Zambia. I'm just interested in the culture of asking for especially the culture of asking for receipts. I don't know from experience in Rwanda, the lottery reward system is proposing how it has worked. Because I've seen it in my country, it was done once, and after it was over, everyone went back to the so I don't know how it works. It's working with Rwanda, it's being implemented.
Thank you for that question. We have observed the same. People are not requesting invoice, but I think through media, tax educations, we think that we can enhance the culture of asking invoice. It's a matter of time. It's a matter of time, but we have to put in place some focused program that will reach citizens, not only those in town, but everyone, starting from even the children, to make sure that the citizen will have that culture of asking the invoice. I think it is the only way of improving the VAT compliance, because this inspections or supply check are limited. They cannot themselves to improve the VAT compliance.
Good. Thank you very much. We can have a little bilateral conversation afterwards. Sorry, Minister.
Thank you. I want just to recognize the importance of this research work by the National Center, because there have been recently a lot of controversial debate about the likely impact on this introduction of electronic billings in the business community in Rwanda, and we are told we have not yet received the final report by the doing business report of the World Bank. See, our bank is of the view that this may negatively impact on some of the indicators in doing business report, particularly the one related to business registration. We don't understand very well this position. We're still discussing. The reason why I'm raising this here, I just want to request IGC to advocate for us.
All right.
Particularly, Richard, as you are a former World Bank staff. Please talk to these people that these saying that they may affect negatively doing business report in Rwanda is.
Yeah, I would be happy to actually have one of your local press people give me a call. I'll be happy to make that point. It's always a favorite pastime of mine to criticize the doing business report. Except when it shows Rwanda very well. Can we move on to the next subject? Thank you very much, Richard. That was a great speech. Andy Zeitlin is the lead academic for the IGC in Rwanda. In his spare time, he's actually an associate professor at Georgetown University, where he teaches economics on faculty. He's a research associate also with the Center for the Study of African Economies at Oxford. He's also a fellow at the Center for Global Development. But of course, he's most well known to us for his work on Rwanda. Andy, please take it away.
Thanks very much. So this is going to be something a little bit different. I think in the spectrum of things that the IGC does, one of the things that we do is try to take important policy questions in the countries in which we work and think about what we can say using theory and international evidence and the like to try to speak to how those might be addressed. And so this is a little bit more in that vein. You won't see any data in this presentation, but I think this is an area where international evidence has a little something to say, and where ultimately I think we might embark. In fact, this has given birth to some work in education and maybe perhaps in other sectors. So one of the issues that we're interested in discussing with the government is sort of how we may take these kinds of questions forward when we think about how to apply this and deepen the research. In any case, this is work that's joined with Radhika and Sally here at the IGC, my colleagues Claire Lever from Oxford and Peter Niels from East Anglia. Peter and Claire give their apologies for not being able to be here. So what we're interested in here is to understand the functioning and potential of a system called Imihigo in Rwanda. This has been formally a part of government practices since 2006, but builds on a long-standing pre-colonial practice in which people undertake public commitments and sort of say what they're going to do and then get held accountable for whether they do it or not. And although it was originally signed by districts alone, this system is expanded to basically encompass 3 tiers. There are Imihigo written for institutions, so the minister has to sign an Imihigo that says what his ministry is going to do, and he is the personal embodiment of that responsibility. They are also signed by districts, which are signed by the mayors on behalf of those districts, and they are signed by individuals within the civil service. So these are, in some sense, quite different contracting problems for sort of the representatives of these institutions or for these individual civil servants within them. But I think what we're going to try to do is lay out a broad framework for thinking about this contracting problem and discuss its potential application in a variety of ways. So we'll focus mostly on civil servants, but in fact I think a fair bit of what we'll say also has implications for the writing of institutional contracts as well. Okay, so what's happening? Well, this was initially lauded as a really important, and I think rightly so, and a really important part of the development story since 2000. But in very recent years, there have been some concerns arising. So for the Americans in the audience, you could say this is, the first of these is what you might describe as a Lake Wobegon effect. This is the fictional radio location in which everyone is above average. And so this is the problem that's arisen here is that in the last round or penultimate round of district scores, every district in the country scored above 90%, with the top at 97%, I believe. So there's not a lot of range going on here, and this gives rise to concerns that either targets are being set inappropriately or they're being set on the wrong indicators to trigger kind of gaming activities. Secondly, this is true both for districts but also within institutions. Secondly, there's a question of, at the ministerial level, of how should institutional contracts be aligned with in order to sort of incentivize the achievement of national development objectives. So Vision 2020, the kind of guiding framework, sets out a range of very ambitious targets, which the minister referred to earlier. And so the question is, how should you then write contracts that define the scope of work for those ministries in order to do the best job you can of achieving them? And in response to these challenges, President Kagame called for a scientific and results-based reform of the Mihigo system. So the task we are sort of set here is to try to do a little bit of thinking about what that might look like. And in order to do that, I'll talk a little bit about sort of theory and some international evidence that may speak to these issues. Okay, so first, from a theoretical perspective, and this is a little too small to read, but just to ground this in something relevant, especially given the present company. The starting point, as you think about within a ministry, within an institution, for example, is the single action plan that lays out the objectives for that ministry. So this is actually an excerpt from the Ministry of Trade's 2012-13 Single Action Plan. And I just want to highlight, because we'll try to link to these in our theory, there are a variety of activities that people are supposed to do. So if you can't read these from the back, they include things like feasibility studies for air cargo, trade missions in various countries, developing position papers, all kinds of things like this. And then these have various targets, things that are supposed to be achieved. They're indicators of whether they've been success. And then those lead into some final outputs that we ultimately care about. So the access to markets, for example, in a variety of countries. And so we want to think through, sort of apply a bit of a theoretical lens to think about this and think about where down this chain of causal, of activities and the consequences that they have should you set the performance targets for individuals within these ministries. Okay, so very basically, you might think of civil servants within these ministries as taking particular actions. They have some outputs. Some of those outputs they can control, and to some extent those outputs depend on what happens with others. So if my job is to organize a trade fair for the Turkish delegation, then that might go wrong for a variety of reasons that don't have anything to do with whether I am effectively reaching out to the Turks or not. And then ultimately this ties to some final outcome. So is there a trade agreement that's achieved? What happens to imports from that country, or exports to that country rather? And those too will of course be affected by external factors. I think a case like trade is one in which those external factors are particularly important because you're subject to exchange rate shocks and all kinds of things. And so the question is to what extent in this drive for being outcome-oriented and scientific should you subject people to the risks that there are down these chains? And so one sort of first principle from kind of contract theory is that the closer you can get to the actions that people are actually taking, the less risk you subject them to in sort of the contracts to which they're held. And everybody under this system, by the way, is being paid sort of some component of their salary depending on whether they achieve their targets or not. So you're not, as you would be doing in sort of standard economic theory, thinking about how strong should I make the incentives. In fact, under the current system, the problem of a manager is I've got an incentive which is reasonably strong, 5% of salary depends upon it, and I have to choose what to tie it to. And if I make that too risky, it just makes the job, I can't change the base salary, and I can't change the strength of the incentive, so that just makes the job less attractive, and exposing people to too much risk might pose problems for retention in the civil service. Okay, so a first guiding principle then is where you can, being scientific doesn't mean that you should not define these performance metrics as far up the causal chain as you can get. And I think I'll just go through a few of these because we won't have time to do them all properly. A second sort of common problem is that people have lots of parts of their job. So I might be responsible for contacting Turkish buyers, and I might be responsible for organizing a trade fair or achieving a treaty or something like that. And all of these are subject to some external shocks, where my basic action is how much outreach am I doing to try to promote this kind of trade. And my ultimate goal is, to increase exports to this particular country. And so a sort of takeaway from this kind of problem is that it makes sense to use any output which is informative about how hard I'm working. So if my activity levels influence both of these outputs, then you should put them both in my contract, at least in this basic setup in which both of them contribute to the eventual goal. So for example, if there are external factors driving output 2, it may matter for the outcome of our trade relations with Turkey, but it shouldn't be part of my contract if I'm not in control of it. Similarly, when there's a long causal chain, it makes sense, this is a sort of reiteration of the basic point, you should get as close to the actions that people are actually taking so that you're sure that, or to the extent possible, you're picking up their activity levels and not things which are far down the causal chain and really just depend on a lot of external risks. Okay, so a second guiding principle here is that we should include additional metrics in the contracts of individuals or indeed ministries if they are informative about how hard those individuals are working towards their ends, and not when they're not informative. Okay, let me skip. So here's, for example, an application. I think I've already talked about it in these terms. Drawing from the single action plan of the Ministry of Trade, there may be some individuals, for example, tasked with the Turkish trade fair, the trade agreement, right? And you should think about if your core job is to liaise with Turkish producers, then it makes sense to have both of these pieces in people's contracts and not just the sort of export shares to Turkey, for example, down the line. Okay, yes, please.
So I don't know if you're going to get to this, but is there a qualitative difference then between, I'm very not familiar with the one, but is there a qualitative difference between an ecosystem and the kind of standard key performance indicators, approach? Is there something where people are actually choosing it themselves, or is it totally top down? So kind of applied might be the difference, but I don't know if that's...
Yeah, no, so I think it is a negotiated process, the deciding of what these indicators should look like. Within some ministries, in some cases, people even suggest them to their managers. So one key question is sort of how well aligned, in the end, are these indicators ending up with the kind of work that people end up doing? And I think a comment Doreen has made in the past is, of course, this is a big challenge, actually. Even if it, top down or bottom up, it's already very hard to align these things with your work plan for the entire year and figure out, how am I going to contribute to export growth in this country over the next year? That's a hard thing to figure out, 11 months out when you may achieve it. And sort of a core recommendation is that it may make sense to work to invest in those planning activities or think about how to build capacity for that kind of planning.
I think it would be very interesting to have the minister tell us about his discussions with the president of the country in negotiating in the equal target. I suspect the word negotiation is misplaced.
Yes. You know what? It's very interesting to have an independent researcher coming in and really look these things in detail. Our experience is that when we started the process, we were all of us excited. But when it comes to evaluation of how your contract has been implemented, people started actually to how to say it, instead of really being ambitious in setting your performance contract, people started to select the easy thing, making the whole process lose substance. The whole process lose substance, and that's the reason why when the president himself started to realize that districts are coming with 99% performance. Ministries, 86, 87. While at the same time, going back and look really how the welfare of the citizen is improving, there is somehow some mismatch. Well, there is somehow some mismatch, and that's the process. The reason why the whole process now is being reviewed, and I hope really this intervention by IGC may be influencing somehow the whole design.
Well, let's hope so. Let's see what Andy has to say. We interrupted.
We hope so too. And I think actually the minister points to something quite important, which is there are several dimensions on which these things might not be performing. One is the rigorousness of the grading, but the other is the choice of indicators. Right? So one is about sort of should these be quantitative or qualitative scores, should they be subjective or objective? But one of the points that we'd like to emphasize is that it matters a lot how you choose what, not as much as it matters how hard you are as a grader, it matters what kinds of criteria you put in, what kinds of sort of dimensions of people's performance get graded at all. Maybe the most famous case of this is the issue of gaming, right, which you see a lot in sort of, you worry about in a lot of other contexts, in which there are things which are, so let's say I care that somebody really does a good job of reaching out to the Turkish trade delegation, for example. And there are many ways, we talked about some of the measurable outputs of that, but maybe I also have their phone records. And so I think, well, you know, phone records are something that's affected by how active they are, and I can look at how many emails they sent and how many phone calls they made to this delegation and the like. So this is kind of the classic case in which you, when people know that, you invite gaming of these metrics. You don't care about the phone calls in and of themselves, and people, when they see them on their contracts, might go out of their way to target those things. So there's a famous case of the incentives in Lincoln Electric, which was a company hiring typists to do lots of work. They were paid by the keystroke, and so they would spend their lunch breaks, you know, typing ASDF, ASDF, ASDF over and over. So, and that's not something that you necessarily valued. Right? So you want to be careful about opening yourself up to incentivizing things that you don't value in and of themselves, and to which people may shift their activity levels. Okay. Teams, I think, is an important issue, but one which maybe I'll come back to if there's interest in the discussion. I think one thing which is actually absent from the formal Mihigo system at the moment is the idea that two people working alongside each other on shared output might have team-based incentives rather than individual ones. That exists in some places. It exists, for example, in the Ministry of Health, where clinics and facilities are rewarded based on shared outcomes, but it's not present in the current system, and to foster cooperation might be something which is considered. So I won't go into too much detail there. Let me just say one other thing from a theoretical perspective, which is the potential role of relative performance evaluation is another sort of under-tapped thing here, particularly in cases where the evaluation criteria are subjective, and you worry that the minister wants to keep his staff happy, and it's hard for him to punish everybody. So there's a little bit of grade inflation that goes on. I don't like to give bad grades to my students either. And the question is, how could you enable the minister, a minister or a line manager, to be in a better position to give tough grades? And one way that that's been done is to enforce a grade distribution in some other settings. So this is a characteristic of the Singaporean civil service, for example, which relies very heavily on subjective performance evaluation, and which makes sure that that doesn't all get gamed by enforcing a grade distribution in which only 10% of people can get top marks. Okay. I think I won't, in the interest of time, go into any detail on the case studies, unfortunately, though I'd be happy to talk about them a little bit more. The other thing that we do then is to think about, well, what can we say about other examples from around the world of how these kinds of problems have been encountered and to some extent resolved. So you see lots of gaming and some ideas about how to fix it in the US Job Training Partnership Act. You see a serious reconciliation with the multitask problem in a pilot in Her Majesty's Customs and Excise system here in the UK. And some interesting other examples from the Singaporean case I've just given, and the Nigerian Federal Civil Service, which I think some very interesting work by researchers here in the UK suggests that we should also think about the kinds of tasks that people have to do. And so that, in particular, in ambiguous settings where it's hard to figure out and where tasks are complex, then these giving people high-powered incentives may not always be an effective thing to do. Okay, so I think I'll wrap up then just about there by saying there's a couple of things that we would take away from this exercise. One is that, as the discussion already has pointed out, doing this well is a really hard thing to do and requires a substantial investment up front and in training and also of people's time. So systems that rely very heavily on it, like the Singaporean one, spend a lot of money on it, and also managers there report that this is how they spend half their time. So you should worry about how much this is going to mean in terms of personnel. We should worry about how people are exposed to risk and what that means for their job satisfaction. We should worry about getting the balance right when people have lots of tasks that they're supposed to do, or where there are temptations to put weight on indicators that can be gained. And I think there's scope for taking on board some of these ideas about team-based indicators and relative performance information to try to better tune the incentives, both of the individuals on the ground and of the managers who have their own personnel problems in trying to figure out how to report on these. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Andy. We'll take one question while Noreen comes up, and I'll introduce, maybe I'll just introduce Noreen, and we'll take questions afterwards, if that's okay. Noreen Karagama is a senior policy analyst in the Office of the President of Rwanda, where she advises the presidencies on issues of economic policy and strategy. Prior to this, Noreen was a diplomat at the Embassy of Rwanda in Washington, D.C., and I didn't know that. I would have been delighted to meet you there. Doreen holds a master's degree in economic and political development from Columbia University, and she's been really a very important partner for us in Rwanda. So Doreen, we're delighted to have you here, please.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to try and be as quick as possible because I realize we're running behind time. Firstly, I want to start by thanking the IGC team because this work is very timely, especially at a time when, like Andrew was saying, we began this process, implementing the GO process in 2006, and so it's about time to revamp and think, what are we doing right? What are we not doing right? This is one of probably my favorite cases of a homegrown solution that has worked well. Why I think it's worked well is because, it's embedded within the Rwandan culture. So it's not something that's, you're trying to convince people, or it's based on a theory in East Asian economies. It's something that my grandmother understands, I understand, everyone understands. And personally, I like to believe that that's one of the reasons why it's been very successful, because you don't need to explain. And people have owned it. People have owned the whole notion of, he talked a little bit about what Imihigo is, but then it's, just to retell you, to give you background, and that's one of the things that I'd like to see in the paper, is once you give a clear context, which I'm going to tell you very quickly, is people understand where you're coming from. So the context is, it's not so much about getting a pay rise or being rewarded monetarily, or it's more seeing there's so much things you need to accomplish, and in order to accomplish that, you set out a public, you make a commitment. So it's more of a commitment than an action plan. So it's also tied to your moral values, and it's also tied to public naming and public shaming. So because of the moral implication behind it, it's an incentive in itself to perform. So I hope that background gives context to why it's been successful and where we're coming from. So I'm going to talk very quickly about 4 things. The first thing is one of the reasons why we've seen Imihigo need to change is that Rwanda is we don't have the luxury of doing things according to how you set things. It's a very fast-changing environment, as most of you have seen. So what your district action plan sets out to do, typically at the end of the year when you're evaluating, is very different from what you actually do. And that's one of the things we've discussed very closely with Sally and Andrew. So one of the things is you wonder if you're in a very fast-changing environment where you set out to, say, construct a road, and then, we need to increase export. It shouldn't take us away from planning, but then one thing I would have wanted to see in the paper is how do you manage that? How do you manage situations where we just don't have the luxury of, everything is so fast-paced, and, so how do you deal with that? Both at a district level, at at a ministerial level and also at an individual level. So what my action plan looks like at the beginning when I set out to do it is very different from what it looks like at the end of the year, just because it's very fast evolving. I like it, I believe, my minister can attest to that. If it wasn't for that, I don't think we'd have an average of 8% growth over the last decade. We wouldn't have lifted 5 million people in less than 5 years. In 5 years, 1 million people out of poverty in just 5 years, So it's things like that that just set the pace going. And so how do you plan for that? Not taking away from that whole notion of don't have a strategy, but how do you link that to? So that's another thing I wanted to highlight. So your paper talks a lot about individual individual rewards and versus, what do you put it somewhere here? Like external factors that you cannot control. So I talked a little bit about that. But then the reason I said we need to contextualize it is it's in our culture, it's not so much about Doreen accomplishing what she set out to do, as it is my failure is a public failure and my successes are celebrated, publicly. So that's one of the reasons why, again, I feel that it needs to be included within, think about it in the way that we. And this we've seen a lot with districts. Districts have been very successful on that front because we find that local leaders are being demanded, what do you call it? Villagers are demanding a lot from their local leaders. And private sector, we have examples of where private sector is saying, let's sign where you go, but there are a lot of factors that are beyond their control. But because it's a public, the public success, the success of District A is celebrated publicly, and the failure of District B, and it's not necessarily, it has nothing to do with, I'll get more money or I'll get a pay raise or things like that. Another thing I wanted to, so I also want to talk about one thing I would have liked to see in the paper is the role of innovation. So many things change, like for instance in Rwanda, we, limited resources, you plan, you have your budget, but then maybe there are aid freezes, or it's a bad season for coffee, or it's a bad season for tea. Commodity prices are always changing. So when that happens, we provide for we reward innovation. So what did you do with the limited resources? Given the limited resources that you have, the weather that you couldn't control, the commodity prices that you couldn't control, how did you still innovate and find ways of accomplishing your overall goal? So that's one of the things that we find over and over again has been very successful, and mostly at an individual level, at a district level as well, ministerial level. That's another thing that we could work on. But I would have loved to see, how we can reward more innovation and how that can be replicated. Another thing that I think that is very important that also would have liked to see in the paper is the importance of reviews, midterm reviews. Again, because I said, you talk a lot about factors that you cannot control, that are out of your control. Like I just talked about, what commodity prices, or like maybe the ministry just doesn't have enough budget to execute the plans that they are set out to do. In that case, once you have a midterm review with your employees, or in this case at a ministry level, if the Prime Minister's office that's evaluating the ministry, having a time to just sit back and say, hey, okay, we had set out to do X, Y, Z, given, maybe we have a lot of resources, we can do more, or there's a limitation in the budget that we had expected to get. Reviewing that saves you a lot from, getting surprised or that aha moment at the end of. And that's one thing we don't do we do midterm reviews for other action plans, like say, we have your national leadership retreats, where we set out to accomplish a number of things, and then halfway through, people sit down and say, okay, you're doing quite well, we grade you A, or we have this trafficking system where if you do so well, it's green, yellow, and orange. So based on that, it helps you, if you have a midterm review, you get a sense for what's working, what's not working, what could you do differently. So that could be replicated at any, is it something that's even possible that you could replicate at an individual level or at a district level? What else do I want to see? Yeah, we talked a little bit about setting high goals, being overly ambitious, and toning down your goals. So how do you reconcile between having excessive ambition versus, like the minister was talking about, having soft targets? And that's one of the things that we've encountered over and over again. On the one hand, you're saying, I'm going to increase exports by 28% because that's what your vision says in the next 5 years. You're going to increase it, but that's looking at where you're at. Maybe your exports are at maybe 4%. Jumping that within a year is not feasible, unless, I don't know, well, I believe in miracles. But then on the other hand, you also don't want to set a goal where you have, I'm going to train 10,000 women. Let's say it's a Ministry of Gender and Women. I'm going to train 10,000 women. That's something that you can do in an hour or so how do you reconcile between setting overambitious goals versus soft goals? So that's one of the things that we're still struggling with. And but although, to answer my question, I feel like a lot of it comes in the planning process. So how you set your goals. Also, you find when we're evaluating, especially districts and ministries, you find that there's a lack of common understanding between what's your impact, what's your output, what's your activity. You know how Andrew was showing the link between 1, 2, 3 until you get to the overall action. So that if someone sets out an activity and that's supposed to, it's implied that it's an impact that will lead to, I don't know, say eradicating poverty by 10%. I don't know if I'm making sense. So most people don't quite understand what the synchronization of A leads to B and C, and vice versa. And that's one of the reasons why, like you quoted the president saying that our impact, our goal needs to be scientific. Initially it was great, and it's this public announcement, I'm going to achieve this, I'm going to construct roads. But then you find that because you're not necessarily thinking about the impact, it's so many activities, you're caught down, you rise up before the sun, sets, and then you go to bed at midnight. You're working so hard. People work very hard, but at the end of the day, runners are still not being lifted out of poverty to the extent that you'd have wanted that to happen. Or at the end of the day, you're scoring 90, like you said, but then HIV or malaria, it's not very impact based. So one of the reasons could be in the planning process, not necessarily understanding how it's done, or it could also be, like I said, overambitious goals and soft targets. I think that's kind of covers it.
If you don't mind, I'll stop you there. You've given Andy a lot of work to do.
So we appreciate
and actually given even more work to do afterwards. I think these are actually quite brilliant comments. So thank you very much. We turn to the last speaker and speakers, I should say, to talk a little bit about coffee and a perplexing problem, a puzzle that Rwanda has. We'll let Rocco describe it rather than me, but let me just let me just say something really quick while we boot this up about Rocco. Rocco Montevello completed a PhD here at LSE, so he's an LSE product. Then moved to Oxford, so he's also an Oxford product. And he's currently an assistant professor at Warwick University. He's a postdoc researcher from the Harvard Kennedy School and is a research affiliate of CEPR, but since he's already booted up, I'm not going to say any more. This is also a joint project with Amit Mojaria. I'm sure I blew that. But he's who is actually a postdoc fellow at Harvard University, and I could read a lot more about him, but I won't.
Thanks, Richard. So I won't abuse my role as a speaker just to comment on the previous talk, but I think it was very interesting, and so I could actually go completely offline and talk about that. Yes, this work is joined with Amit Mojaria. We're a very well-functioning team. He does all the work, and then I go around and present it. And I'm just back from Kigali, in fact, where with Richard and Sally we presented this work to policymakers last week. Okay, so we're going to talk about fully washed coffee, which is essentially the part of the chain, or sort of the way to do coffee that adds value for the part of the chains that happen in producing countries. And there are basically a few kind of key questions. If you are in a hurry, that's the answer you want to know from the talk. The first one is fully washed coffee profitable in Rwanda? That's an issue. The government has pushed a lot the sector, but question has been raised on whether it is profitable, and our study suggests that yes, it is profitable for Rwanda. It makes sense to invest in fully washed coffee. If it is profitable for the country, why is it that only 30 to 40% of the total production of coffee in Rwanda is exported as fully washed? We're going to argue is because of low capacity utilization in the stations, and we're going to say, in fact, that if Rwanda could double the amount of fully washed coffee exported, holding constant the total volume produced of coffee and quality, that will lead to an increase of 10 to 20% of the export revenues for the country. We're going to argue that this is possible. And to make it possible, what are the key constraints that needs to be addressed? Essentially, constraint in the way the market for cherries, in the relationship between the stations and the farmers work, especially in issues of sourcing and finance. And we'll see that they are very interrelated. And then, of course, Richard has had the fourth question, which is why, guys, has taken him 2 years to come back to us with some result. The reason is that Amit has painfully put together an impressive amount of data, which I'm not going to go through. But basically, a lot of the data actually is a survey that we conducted in Rwanda, funded by the IFC in 2012, where basically we talked to all the active stations in Batia, interviewing managers, workers, farmers, and collectors. And then we have basically assembled a lot of data which was already sitting there in agencies that are involved in the regulation and overseeing of the coffee sector, but was just not put together and sort of make it work for policy purposes. And so, what can be done about it? I'm gonna give you a little bit of an overview. Just very quickly, overview of the coffee chain. There are some important facts come out here. The main diagnostic in a way, so we're gonna name the disease, and then we're gonna talk about solutions. I'm gonna rush, because I really want to spend some time on the solution. So, we have, without going into detail, we've kind of tried to come up with a breakdown of the value chain, the value addition in the chain for fully washed versus ordinary or home processed coffee. There are 3 facts that I want you to focus on. The first one is the difference in unit price at the FOB level, so this is the export that the government cares about, between fully washed and ordinary coffee. The difference is about $1.4. This is small. We are told by people in the sector that this can be much higher, in fact. There are problems with quality. There are also issues of diversification. Both chains are incredibly concentrated in terms of their export destination. The 4 largest buyers account for the 70% of the export of fully washed coffee and ordinary coffee as well. But the difference is that the size of the buyer comes with a big discount in terms of prices when we look at the fully washed coffee. So returns to sort of diversifying markets and buyers, I think, are pretty high. So the computation we do, the number I gave you before on the increase of export revenue, is holding constant with this 1.4. But that's a big lower bound in a way to the improvement that the sector can bring, because the 1.4 really could become bigger. The second thing I want to suggest is that, yes, on aggregate, the country as a whole, there is more value addition in fully washed than in ordinary, but not all actors in the chain benefit from fully washed relative to ordinary. At least in 2012, it appeared that the middle exporters, which are very concentrated, had much higher margins in doing ordinary than in doing fully washed coffee. We are told that this is changing with all basically the big players in the last couple of years entering much more strongly in the fully washed, which I think is a very interesting development. And so that number might have come down. But in thinking about promoting the sector is going to bring fully washed coffee, is going to bring more surplus to farmers and labor which is employed in the countryside. It's going to bring more export revenue, but it doesn't necessarily bring more profit to everybody involved in the chain. And then, yes, it is on aggregate profitable for the country. So if it is profitable, why is it that only 35% of the coffee is exported as fully washed? Well, in order to do fully washed coffee, you need a washing station. There was basically no washing station in the early 2000s. The government has been very active in promoting entering. And 10 years later, basically there are more than 200 coffee washing stations around the country. And in fact, the capacity installed will be sufficient to process around at least 70% of the overall coffee produced in the country. In fact, when you look at capacity utilization, you have a lot of firms, this is data from 2012, you have, of course, firms that have above 100 capacity utilization, so they are fully utilized. There were a bunch of firms that are completely not even operating, so capacity installed but not used. But even for those that were operating, many firms were just far away from operating at the full capacity. Okay? So, and in fact, if you look at the last 2 years, what has happened is that the number of stations that have kept on being built has increased. The total number of installed stations has gone up. But the number of active stations in every single season has pretty much remained constant. So if anything, overall capacity utilization is coming down, which suggests that policy shouldn't, now perhaps the sector has reached the maturity whereby the policy focus should be a little bit more away from entry and much more towards strengthening the capacity of the stations. We're going to be specific about how that can be done. The need to strengthen the capacity of the station is very well reflected in the survey by the fact that there is a very large heterogeneity in the productivity and efficiency of the stations. Take 200 stations, look at the top 20 and the bottom 20, and their efficiency in terms of unit cost is about the efficiency of the top 20%. The top 20 station is about 2.3 times as large as the efficiency of the worst station. So very big gap. You have some stations which are very well run and some stations that are very poorly run. So that, of course, is the bad picture. But if you look at it from the bright side, of course, that also there's a lot of scope for improvement if one can make the bad station not work well. So when you ask the managers in the station, what are the main constraints that you face to operate? Well, of course, everybody will always tell you competition. Competition will always come on top. Nobody likes to have competition. So disregard that. It is a concern, as that's what our study in a way demonstrate very clearly. But let me focus on the middle one, which is a sort of access to finance. The third one is road. We are not engineers, but I'm sure that everybody is aware in Rwanda about the situation of the road in the countryside, which are very good. But for the station are really located in rural areas, and they need to move trucks and so forth. So let me talk about finance. So finance is a key issue in the coffee washing stations because the working capital requirement, which is essentially purchasing the cherries from the farmers, are extremely high. For about 70 to 80% of the final revenue for a coffee washing station. For SMEs in the manufacturing sector, that number is more like 20 to 40%. So it's is a sector that has a much bigger demand for working capital finance. At the same time, it's a very risky sector, price fluctuating in the international market. It's also difficult and costly because these firms are located in rural areas. So, and indeed the coffee washing station as a result, they get their working capital finance partly from financial institutions, but a big chunk also from downstream buyers, the exporters that are so concentrated and that we were sort of discussing before. Okay? There's a lot of finance that comes from the downstream buyers. This is typical in this type of chain, but it just seems to be particularly pronounced, this phenomenon, in the case of Rwanda. So as a result, we estimate, but this is a sign that indeed accessing finance is difficult, and so the results from the survey confirm that we estimate approximately 60% of the coffee washing stations in the 2012 campaign were financially constrained, which means if you could find a way of lending to these stations, they will make more profit than what would be the cost of lending to them. So what to do? Okay, so when you have a financial constraint, that are really the first thing you think about, well, let's expand the supply of credit to these coffee washing stations. Traditionally, this is done by sort of subsidizing credit access. This has been done also in the case of Rwanda, we understand. We would argue that in this type of chain, probably that's not a great idea for a variety of reasons. And instead, there are other type of financing mechanisms that emphasize value chain financing, and so strengthening market access and lending to a station that have already established contracts with downstream buyers. We can talk more about that, but what we really want to talk about is kind of looking at things from the other side. Try to reduce the demand for for working capital at the station level, rather than try to focus it, rather than exclusively focusing on increasing supply, try to reduce the demand. And how can you reduce the demand of working capital finance by the station? Well, you can do that if you get the farmers to sell on credit. Now, you may think, this is completely surreal. Rocco, are you saying that we should have small farmers selling on credit to large firms? Yes, that's what I'm saying. First of all, this is what's happening in other sectors. So, for instance, in tea, that's exactly what already happens in Rwanda. But first, the farmers deliver the tea, and then it's paid at the end of the month, depending on the sales of the factory. It also happens in a variety of other countries, and I'm going to tell you the example of a country which I think is particularly relevant as an example for Rwanda, which will be Costa Rica. So, potentially there's a huge win-win if you get farmers to sell a little bit more on credit to the station than what is currently done now. At the moment, basically, in 2012, when we did the survey, there was almost no sales on credit from the farmers to the station. I told you what is a win for the point of view of the station, of course. Instead of having to finance 60–80% of your final revenue as working capital, you now just first get the revenue and then pay the farmers. what about the farmers? So when we ask the farmers, why is it that you process at home instead of selling to the station? Of course, the first issue is, oh, the station is too far, so that's one issue. But the other issue is actually, well, you know, if I process at home, I can sell the coffee when I want. Because once you process at home, the coffee becomes storable, the parchment is storable, and then the farmer can sell little by little when he needs the cash. Or perhaps he can keep the money and sell it when he needs to pay the school fees. Instead, if you sell cherries and everything is paid cash, all of your income comes as a windfall, and actually farmers don't like it. So farmers have a demand, in fact, for smoothing their income, which will be matched by having a system in which farmers sell to stations on credit. There's also another aspect which is key, and that I'll emphasize less in this talk, in the relationship between the farmers and the station. Namely, the station before harvest season can also provide a lot of inputs and training and fertilizer to the farmer. And this also basically does not happen at all. Okay? So this two-way relationship between the farmers and the station are just very, very underdeveloped in the case of Rwanda. And why is it that this doesn't happen? Well, we spend a lot of time measuring trust between the farmers and the station. And basically you see that the amount of trust between the farmers and the station very positively correlate with the efficiency of the station, okay? With the lower unit cost. There's really a lack of trust between farmers and station. Now, these problems are very common in agricultural value chain. So historically, government has sort of tried to think about ways of, let's say, build trust, or if you like, regulate, or improving the market functioning in this agricultural value chain. And so, imagine a line where you sort of have down here is anarchy, okay, and up here on the right is complete state monopoly. So it's increasing level of coercion or involvement by the state. I'd say that Rwanda at this stage is around here, a little bit towards anarchy. By anarchy, I mean a situation in which everybody buys and sells without sort of pre-commitment in spot markets. And instead, because the relationship between stations and farmers to be efficient is really an intertemporal one, the station gives input to the farmer, and the farmer produces and sells on credit, then these spot transactions are not very efficient. That's why I kind of put the Rwanda now close to the anarchy. So historically, one thing that government have done in this type of value chains to regulate has been to come up with zoning regulation. But as, first of all, Rwanda is committed to a sort of a free market approach, which I think is a very good idea. And also, as you have countries which have better capabilities and also more newly available IT technology, it's possible to actually move in the direction of having more, less interventionist regulation and more sort of regulation that just support the market to work better, okay? Towards working better and enforcing this type of contracts between the stations and the farmer. And so, one way in which one country which I've that I'm studied where this happens, and it happens quite well, it seems, is Costa Rica, which is in fact considered a kind of a role model for countries that are sort of small and want to focus on high quality coffee. All coffee exported from Costa Rica is fully washed. The system has tried to be implemented in other Latin American countries. They failed, mostly for political reasons. So there are also lessons, I think, from failure to adopt. So let me, Richard, how am I doing in terms of time? Do I have time to describe Costa Rica?
Just a little bit.
Okay, in Costa Rica there is a law which is very old, it's almost 100 years old law, which regulates the structure, the law is called about regulating the structure of relationship between farmers, stations, and exporters. I think it's important to have in mind that there is a law which is specifically devoted to address the problems that I've sort of described. How does the system in Costa Rica work? At the time of harvest, I focus on harvest, not on pre-harvest, farmers deliver the coffee and receive an advance payment and a receipt. And the receipt has a legal value. It's like a contract where there is a uniform type of contract that the law regulates and say, look, this has legal value. Okay? It's a contract that in a way the board, the coffee board, steps in and say, this contract will be enforced. Then the washing station reports to the, I call it NAEB, but of course it's the ICAFET, the Costa Rica board, but it's the equivalent of NAEB, all the quantity received from the farmers. So the government knows how much each farmer now has already been paid and how much is supposed to be paid at the end of the harvest season. In Costa Rica, actually, it turns out that the station also report all their sales contract, and this is because the board is involved in determining the final payment that the farmers have to receive. So there's an extra element of involvement in the downstream part of the chain. And then finally, the station, based on the price announced by the government, pays the farmer for whatever it hasn't paid with the advances. Okay? But the key is that the reason why the farmers believe at the stage that they will get the money at the end of the season, in fact, they get it in 3 installments plus a final liquidation.
May I ask a question?
Yes. Yes.
You say in this Costa Rica model, the government knows what should be the remuneration of the farmer based on the international price the country is getting.
Yes. So
how would the government knows that? And how to make sure in this system an efficient manager of a coffee washing station is remunerated according to his efficiency?
Exactly. So what I was going to say, I answer in a second, is exactly that. I think it is possible in an initial phase to focus on this first part, the enforcement of contract, without actually moving directly to also trying the government to be involved in fixing the final price that the farmers receive. In the case of Costa Rica, turns out that the system, that system that they've implemented achieves efficiency, but it achieves also equity in the sense that because the government monitors very closely the costs bear by the station, the cost of the campaign, and then fixes the price basically based on the international price, in the end the farmer gets a very high share of the final FOB price. But to do that, and that's the reason why I'm saying, you'll see where I'm going to go, that I would suggest Rwanda to first focus on the aspect of enforcing contract, and in the process building the capabilities to also do the second step. But that I think should be postponed, because indeed the Costa Rica model has these advantages, but requires a lot of capabilities, not just at the level of the board, because they have to monitor cost, and they are also very sophisticated in the way they deal with the marketing process, but also a lot of sophistication at the level of the station, the farmer themselves, and especially the banks also. So there is an amount of capabilities that has to be built before one, I believe, can fully implement the Costa Rica model. But there are still lessons to be learned in terms of focusing on contract enforcement. So let me skip the practical aspects. This is the stuff that we are discussing with NIAB. So going back to the minister's remark with which we opened the session today, can IGC help? And if yes, how and when? So the very first thing we have to do, I was in Kigali this week, is assist NIAB in the formulation of Rwanda coffee development policy, which is happening right now. So we have received from NIAB the current draft. The current draft has outlined 7 key objectives that the next policy framework for Rwanda should have. And I don't walk you through the all 7, but there are at least 4 which are very directly related to all the talks that I've just discussed here. In preparing towards, and these are sort of the conversation we try to have perhaps with NIAB in the next following months, if we think about trying to move towards the Costa Rica model, I think the first thing that needs to be done is strengthening data and monitoring capacity within NIAB. I think that's the number one issue, and we are available to help on that. That should happen this season. There's at the same time a mapping of the sector that needs to be done, integrating all the different data that already NIAB collects. There's perhaps plans to have a new coffee farmer census. We can also assist with advice on current regulation. Let me spend 1 minute to talk a little bit about entry. So this is what Amit has put together. So based on work by engineers that have sort of come up with criteria for the optimal placement of stations, we have essentially collected a huge amount of GIS information from Rwanda, and now we can tell the government at the very fine level, at the 1 square kilometer level, whether a certain place is a good place to have stations or not. Of course, the market, because there was free entry, the market has already brought in a lot of stations, and mostly these stations are indeed in the place where there is a sort of good potential, where it's cost beneficial. In fact, the problem is that there might have been even too much entry in this area, in the south and in the west, which are the most cost effective, because you see that in fact there is a lot of overlap in the catchment areas of these stations. So they are sitting on top of each other, and they make it very difficult to build a relationship with the farmers, this type of competition. But at the same time, you see there are also areas where perhaps the additional new station should be prioritized. Or if there is a guy that comes in and says, look, I want to relieve a station that is not functioning well, you can sort of advise a little bit on directing that. Then I think for the following season, we can instead plan a little bit and think a little bit better about real intervention to strengthen the capacity of the station. But I wouldn't want to rush in this type of intervention into the next season. I'd say let's focus on developing the plan, strengthening the capacity, the monitoring capacity, and then thinking about intervention for the 2016 campaign. That's it. A few final words. There is one word which is missing from this slide, which is a big fan to NAB, because really from the beginning of this research, in fact, they implemented the survey. The team leaders were employees from NAB, and they have been fantastic in sharing all sorts of information. The IGC will provide support, and also a variety of stakeholders. We have a lot of people in Rwanda asking about coffee. So we look forward to an exciting collaboration. Really on that, let me link to Doreen's point. I think, it was interesting for me to see the talk before on the public sector, because I work on the private sector, but because when I travel to work on private sector, I actually encounter people that work in the public sector. In this case, people from NAB and other agencies. And it's true that one thing that strikes me about Rwanda, even in comparison to other IGC countries where I sort of do work, is the type of individual that I encounter in the agencies I meet. And so I think it was very nice to hear sort of a view more on the incentive schemes, and sort of knowing that Rwanda is also keen on having incentives in place. But there seems to be in the public sector something that is working well, and that perhaps allows this incentive to work well, which is sort of selection of people into the public sector. So I will, by linking this with these remarks to the previous.
Let's take some questions, not on the last comment, which was, I think, illuminating, but on the coffee washing station story.
Yeah.
Do we, is this credible? Do we like this story? Is the issue a matter of imperfect markets working here and making markets work better through contract enforcement?
Rocco, I'd love to hear just that graph you put up maybe 30 slides ago, which showed the relationship between trust and efficiency. I'm not sure I understood the sort of core mechanism that you thought was at work there. So could you just talk briefly about why you think trust is associated with greater efficiency?
Yes. So the mechanism is as follows. In order for a station to operate efficiently, this type of intertemporal relationship with the farmer has to be in place. Both because having cherries on credit allows you to reduce the cost of finance, but more importantly, if you have a good relationship with the farmers, you can plan and have very good capacity utilization. And in fact, the first thing, so if you have a good relationship with the farmers, you have a more regular capacity utilization. So the first thing that we document, in fact, in the academic version of the paper, of course, is that indeed competition, or if you like exogenous drivers of competition, are associated with lower capacity utilization, which if you remember is kind of the big problem in this sector. This lower capacity utilization, of course, increases the unit cost of operating the station. It doesn't increase the cherry prices, because the aggregate amount of cherries which is processed in the market actually doesn't increase as a result of competition. It increases, and that will be fine. That means what the markets will be about is competition increasing the cherry prices. What the competition does is that it increases the unit labor cost of processing coffee. Of course, if you can, when you don't have coffee, you send people home, then that wouldn't happen. But we argue that the labor market is such that, indeed, that doesn't happen. So it happens to a large extent, but not completely. And so competition leads to irregular capacity utilization, which leads to higher unit labor cost. And now the question is, where does trust fit in? Well, competition also reduces the measured amount of trust. Now, since there is no way of writing enforceable contract between the farmers and the station, it has to be some kind of relational contract, if you like, built on trust between the farmers and the station that sort of govern that capacity utilization. And so we are arguing that our way of measuring trust, which you can talk about, captures indeed the quality of relationship between the farmers in the catchment area and the station.
But just to follow up, if that's true, why doesn't, I guess I don't see the market failure here. If I'm capable of establishing this relational contract that you're talking about, I should have a comparative advantage in this market. I should be able to outcompete any other entrant.
Indeed.
And exit should just solve the problem, right?
So first of all, the station, when you have installed the station, exit is happening in the industry. It happens through a process whereby someone else takes over the station, because the station owns it. Exactly. And so we have seen in the last couple of years, in fact, the expansion of private sector players who probably bring more managerial professionalism in the way they run the station. And so I had a 2-hour conversation with the managers of 6 coffee washing stations for Dormans. Dormans is leading Kenyan exporter of specialty coffee, which they managed six coffee washing stations. And indeed, this guy was a manager, from the Netherlands with background in finance. The first thing he does, he establishes a monitoring system, and then he starts building the trust. So indeed, in some stations it's happening, but in many other stations it doesn't. In fact, one issue that I haven't talked in the presentation, which I think goes somewhere here, I believe there is a line, at least on this. So, point 3 of the objective of the next month, support and strengthen coffee farmers organizations. These are basically the COP. There are a lot of cooperatives in the coffee sector, many of which are in charge of managing stations. One thing we see is that indeed the level of managerial capacity between the private sector firms and the COP was very starkly different in all sorts of dimensions, in terms of experience, in terms of education, in terms of remuneration. Just the salary of, these firms manage $500,000, $800,000 in a campaign, and we're talking about managers that touch like $1,000. How can you expect sort of not there being all sorts of issues with stealing and misappropriation when that's the case? So indeed, a lot of what we are describing indeed comes from the COP, being need to be better managed.
Well, we're just going back to the, if NIAB does this, if they take these points 1 through 7 and implement these, and of course the Rwandan government has a unique capability to implement policy. If they do the first part of the Costa Rica model and improve contract enforcement, how soon could we expect the 10 to 20% increase in exports? Because that's what you mentioned.
No, so
the good news is a lot of exogenous factors going on. So
I say so on the issue of the I think this will be the fun part, Richard, to work out with the folks. And I will see a little bit what they think. We really have, I think, productive meetings to, probably ex-ante were a little bit more thinking about, you can indeed incentivize government officials, give them targets to make sure that, you put them in charge of stations and see how well the stations do and so forth. Perhaps there are other ways of doing it, but we need to think a little bit. So, I don't know. This answer is I don't know. I don't know, because there is you see, when I talk about the 10 to 20%, that's kind of holding constant quantity and quality, if you like, of coffee produced. But if the relationship between the station and the farmers improve, that actually won't stay constant. Because, for instance, one big problem in the case of Rwanda is actually the very low productivity of the coffee trees. And that in part comes perhaps by just the demographic of the coffee tree, which tend to be quite old in terms of stock. In part comes from research that has to be done on the level of which kind of trees we need to plant and varieties. But in part it also comes from the fact that just poor farming practices and so too little extension services or too inefficient extension services.
But can I just ask you a
so
follow-up question?
One would imagine a model in which the station becomes sort of in charge of doing the extension service.
But let's take your price effects. I want to ask a question that the minister actually asked to me, which was, a lot of these are small farmers with farming on small plots. 2/3 of their plot is devoted to food crops and another third to coffee, let's say. If the farmer were able to get a higher premium, a higher payment, a higher profit from the coffee, in your experience, in your interviews with farmers and the coffee washing stations, together with what you know from Costa Rica, would you expect that over a 5 or 10 year period you would see an expansion of the coffee sector?
So yeah, that definitely, so to the extent that these are sort of, let me not talk about Costa Rica, let's talk about Uganda, which of course is a different sector because we mainly do Robusta, so it's a shorter chain. But they had a lot of deduction and regulation till I think the early 2000s that were keeping the share of prices that the farmers were getting pretty low. And when they got rid of this regulation and the share of the FOB price that goes to the farmer jumped up, they had a massive expansion in production. So actually, so this was an interesting conversation that we had in Kigali where some people from the government were suggesting perhaps farmers are no longer interested in coffee. There are other things, mining is a nice thing to be doing. But that's kind of holding constant the price that they are getting now, and that, my sense, I think, can be increased. And then I would imagine that the supply response would be pretty elastic.
And the quality response, would that change with if they introduce these things?
I think so. I think the quality, and this I should say, this was a point that I underemphasized in the Kigali presentation and was instead sort of stressed by the people from ag. I think the quality, if there will be a response, will come if we get this part of the relationship right, so to speak. Yeah. So having more efficient extension services and being those extension services essentially being done by the station.
So we could expect that he could put in his performance requirement, it would not be 10 to 20% increase, but maybe 30 or 40%.
I'm against explicit incentive in the public sector of the paradox, so I'm the bad person to ask. Yeah, so you had a question.
No, I don't have a question. I just want to make a few comments on this research paper. Because I think it's a very important work. And personally, I'm very excited to continue discussion with IGC on this. Because I've been monitoring the coffee sector in Rwanda for many years. I know a little bit the problems with the coffee washing station. There are issues I'd like to discuss further. And it's very important that this study should not be taken in isolation of the whole strategy to develop further the coffee sector in the country. And I'm very happy that you are engaging with NAIB to help them really elaborate a whole coffee strategy which may generate more growth in the sector. There are some questions, in my view. I have a feeling that the research has not looked in detail, which may have a bearing on the conclusions and the recommendation. So the first one, it clearly said in the report that farmers get better remuneration when they sell the coffee to the coffee washing station rather than selling to the exporter of the ordinary coffee. Why, if this is correct, why in that context they don't sell 100% of the coffee to the coffee washing station?
So,
but let me continue.
Yeah.
Because the reason why I'm raising this issue here is that maybe we need to look in detail in practice how things work. Coffee washing station, you may be aware that when the farmers bring their cherries, coffee washing station don't buy them like as the farmers bring them. There is a sorting exercise, and farmers sometimes are required to go back with some of the cherries. You see? And I think this is a key issue at the center of this whole business, because if coffee washing station already select the cherries they buy from the farmers, farmers have a problem, because when they process the coffee from their own and sell to the exporter of the ordinary coffee, there is no selection there. The exporter of the ordinary coffee buy everything. Now, you see, from a farmer perspective, he will be reluctant to bring you cherries when he knows you are going to take 60% of it and go back with the kind of very low quality cherries which he will be in trouble to process and sell them there. And when you compare the prices at the export of the coffee wash, the free washed coffee and the ordinary, actually the justification of the difference in the premium of the quality is there. Is there. So I think there are issues there we need to see and understand exactly how to develop a coffee washing station business, not only at the level of the manager of the coffee washing station, but in partnership with the farmers, because all the issues are going to be developed at this level. And the only way we can really achieve that is the farming contract we have been talking about, the contract between the farmer and the processor, should not just be a buying contract. It should be a comprehensive partnership, including sharing the risk at the production level. The owner of the coffee washing station actually, and I hope this is going to be the policy NAEB is implementing, the coffee washing station has to be designed as a kind of hub spot for the whole strategy to develop the coffee industry in such a way, for example, part of the business being done by NAEB in the extension services should be actually subcontracted with the coffee owner. The coffee owner starts to build a real operational working relationship with the farmer. The second point on which I'd like to comment is about access to finance. Actually, this is one of the key critical issues which justify why some of the coffee washing stations in Rwanda have been failing and are not getting coffee from the farmers as well. What is happening is that those who export ordinary coffee, they use a network of traders. These exporters of ordinary coffee, they have working relationships with the banks, and they can get money anytime they apply for a loan. So they pre-finance buying coffee from the farmers using the network of traders. Even sometimes farmers are paid before they harvest coffee. You see? And this network of competition is very important because most of the coffee washing station owners they have a very serious problem of working capital. Some of them have not developed good working relationship with the banks, and they can only pay the farmers with delay. When you compare to the exporter of the ordinary coffee and a poor manager of a coffee washing station who have issue to get money from the bank in time they want, that's the justification of why coffee washing stations are really not getting coffee. The big part of it is going to the exporter of ordinary coffee. Now, what is happening today, you mentioned rightly that big operators in the global market who are coming to the opportunity in Rwanda, the main explanation of their success is that they have no financial issues. Actually, they are now competing with the exporters of ordinary coffee in pre-financing the farmers to get the coffee from them. That's exactly the whole, the whole story. And if they can even develop a working relationship with the farmers to engage in extension services, I'm convinced by developing such kind of model, there will be a growth of coffee going through the coffee washing station instead of going through the ordinary coffee. The last point I want to mention, this development of professionals who are coming in develop such kind of relation with the farmers is a very good news. But in my view, it will not be sufficient to grow the coffee production in Rwanda if the structural constraints that Richard mentioned about how big or small is the elasticity of production to an increase of price to the farmer is in Rwanda in the current production system. Because coffee in Rwanda is mainly produced by smallholder farmers who have, in average, a quota of a hectare of land. And they have over time decided, and this is not new, something around 10% of the land is used for coffee. And even if you ask them how this happened, that in a long period of time, the land covered by coffee has not changed. They will tell you actually, it was not my own decision to grow coffee on 10% of my land. There is a history of that. There was actually a government requirement sometime to do so. You see? Now, today, when you ask such a farmer to increase the acreage covered by coffee, when the coffee is competing with other crops, mainly food crops, it's a very big decision. Particularly when he knows if we decided to double the coffee plantation on his own land, which doesn't change, we only expect to get revenue 5 years later. Because it takes 5 years to start harvesting coffee. This is the main reason why, if you look at the trend of coffee production in Rwanda, despite the innovations of coffee washing station, whatever you want, the production is not moving at all. It has been, it's fluctuating around. And for me to break this, the only way to break this is for professional exporters or professional operators in the coffee industry to find a way to help in breaking this cycle by investing in the coffee production. And I think there is a possibility for that. When you go around Rwanda and look to these coffee washing stations which are operated by traders, around them there is quite plenty of land which is not used even for food crops. And there is a potential at least to start growing big coffee plantation around the coffee washing station. And I even know that some of the coffee farmers, or some of the farmers may be willing to lease their land to the investors if they are willing to expand the coffee plantations. And the government may even facilitate such kind of transactions if there is really an interest for the country to grow the volume of coffee exports in the future. You see, if we shift from the current situation where the production is dominated for 100% in the hands of smallholder farmers to a model where professional operators in the coffee industry engage either from their own in developing coffee plantations or in a partnership with the farmers, because there are some investors who are operating in some districts who simply go and negotiate with the farmers, lease land model, and agree on how to grow coffee together and share the risks and the revenues. I think these are the key issues really we need to understand and see how to advise NAEB going forward to address the issues in the coffee industry.
You've got 5 minutes to give an answer to the 6 points that the minister raised. There's a question in the back, but no, not a question, sorry. We're really running over time. You guys, the audience has been very patient, but
we are complete. I'd say that we are completely on the same page. You know, I've told the story this way. I could have told it like that. You told it like that. I think we are really talking about the same thing. Be it the finance, I believe indeed that this difference in markup in rents that I'm describing is exactly the premium that comes from accessing finance, because you don't need financiers, so the difference reveals exactly what's the cost of having a financier. That's number one. So finance, I agree, is an important issue. On the issue of the elasticity of supply, I agree with you. The plantations are very small, and the land is also scarce in Rwanda, and it's particularly in the places that we're talking about. There are really 2 avenues. The first avenue is increasing yields, because the yields are very low. So actually, supply can respond not by planting, not by increasing area, it means planting more trees, but by increasing yield. And the other one, which is something I've learned during this trip, is indeed this issue of the consolidation. So there was indeed a regulation that say when you want to open a station, you should have a small estate around which supply at least 20-25%. My sense is that hasn't been enforced. But we have seen in other sectors where NIAB is involved, tea, that the government is incredibly involved in sort of reallocating land and creating a state. So perhaps there is a little bit of that can be done at a smaller scale, because of course the sector is different in the case of coffee. I think that should be very high up in the agenda. But these are the kind of issues that you just detailed them with much big precision, but I think these are really the issue that I have in mind when we talk about those. Improving quality, improving yields, because you teach farmers how to do it, you manage the farms, the coffee farm, professionally, you give the right inputs, the right fertilizer, the right contractual structure. So we'll have to see how to do it. But I think the key I think is to be, and I think we are on the same page, that these guys are the ones that have to play the big role for sure, as opposed to what's happening now. Yeah. So
thank you very much, Robert. I want to thank all of the audience. I would invite you to Rwanda to taste some of the best coffee in the world. It's really spectacular. I want to thank the minister particularly for being a discussion on the coffee project very eloquently, and on actually the other presentations as well. And Doreen and Richard, thanks very much.
Yes, thank you so much. Oh, this is the thing about the study about the conference. No, thanks a lot for the commentary. I was in the conference this week. So I don't know on trying to understand. So there is an called root culture. So I worked a lot with them to understand exactly how they land. And they need to ask a more based on most of the time things right. Precisely I try to make my presentation He's the guy who does all the wall.
I told them I don't agree with you, but we need to do the right things to reactivate this industry.
The manager of GrowthWeek, which is a subsidiary of Taxpayers, one of the three largest traders of coffee. They were managing one station, 12 stations in 2014, and they want to manage 20 stations. Really, if you run exactly for the right market, you can slowly see as a desire to invest in the station that the size of the sector is going to or even the donors, very much so the price is so if one increase the quantity, you can triple by the price difference.
The quality is looking free and the good quality is very
No, it's the quantity.
They buy high quality cherries.
Instead of asking when the cherries are ripe, let me just ask if I can bring and see what happens. And so it's the issue of training the farmers to work from the beginning in the incentive. But the other one, so when the inflation is off, and inflation is so donors, of course, will do it.
Actually, what is happening now is the number of slated to increase. Have started to do something themselves. They accept all the cherries from us and they do something for themselves.
No, they just don't. So that makes the production in the different trades. We see a lot of factors. You see, even coming out from the station, a lot of bad created drink companies and farmers, but they don't reject the some might reject if it's really super. But by and large, they don't reject the market.
They buy everything. The individual is massive to the farmer. They improve the price.
That's right.
The other issue I need to raise, maybe when we need to look further, the coffee quality ratio of the international market increase due to the global market price. When the price go up, the offer rewards the coffee price doesn't set. There is no incentive to simulate, which means all those who go to coffee have to
No, it is,
So that's why you want to move towards this specialty. So then you can sort of get premium.
no, thanks for the we keep on we keep on engaging. The next few days we send some comments on the plan and then we try to discuss time. I also think this issue was very interesting.
Can we have lunch tomorrow? The stuff is still here. Ah, no, maybe he will fall. Yeah, I think that will go. In any case, we'd be delighted to invite you. Okay. Yeah, okay. Talk to Doreen and the ambassadors from we can talk about things we might use
And I think tomorrow you are in the private sector. The matching with you, because that's the kind of so we would some idea of I only had a few meetings, but I have some ideas on the yard. So now the IGC could engage in a way which is useful for the yeah. So so I still know little, because basically I talked to the guys in the parking system just with the so we want to try to say, so the proper baseline mines are issue on the value of the mines, which are very important, financial resistance, productivity. But both, for sure, I know 2 liters for me now, to say I don't want to talk about things that I didn't know. But one way in which in the coffee what we did is that we received a lot of money, and then after 3 years we actually went out to get something else. Imagine myself that might be a way where from the beginning we have something that is already useful. And one thing that I described is all the Ministry of Natural Resources, which is essentially in charge of tracking, so basically nothing that I was only tracking. And that's dedicated to the but the ministry itself is actually tracks the operation of both the mines and the and this is done for monitoring. I give you many times where we do that. And then I and basically because it can pay that check is very cumbersome. There's an issue of checking and then there is also an issue of incentive. There are probably where the incentive overstream the amount of so maybe that there are problems that see what the is the first thing we have to think about digitalizing the process of one. Exactly. che partiva la storia the other thing was, and we basically business association and digitalize their records, which they need to do in order to enforce the regulation. So I'm kind of fancy something similar. And you see the beauty of the process, you see from an academic mind, there's not much to tell, but in industry it's not, you know, there was a return for their stakeholders. And for the money, that would be an exercise for them.